There are many things that can be taken from a woman: her name, her years, the certainty of where she will sleep tonight. But there is something that does not surrender, even when they try. Celestina was 16 years old when her mother handed her over to a married man, and 24 when she arrived, carrying her son to the gate of some calla lily fields in the highlands of Chiapas. Without knowing that there awaited her the people who were going to give her everything back. Welcome. If this story reaches your heart, subscribe to the channel and comment from which part of Mexico or the world you're joining us tonight. Celestina Pacheco grew up on a small ranch in southern Chiapas, the eldest of 4 children of a woman alone who carried debts all her life with the same resignation with which she carried the sack of corn, without complaining, without asking when it would end. Her mother, Elvira, was one of those people who confuse the sacrifice of their children with love, and who, when they can no longer pay a bill of their own, look among those around them for something to offer in exchange. Celestina was the most she had. The day Celestina turned 16, Elvira signed a paper before the town magistrate. The paper said that Celestina was bound as a domestic servant to Mr. Amador Castellanos for a period of 5 years, in exchange for the cancellation of a land debt that Elvira had been dragging along for a decade. The magistrate signed. Celestina signed nothing. No one asked her to. That same afternoon, while Celestina still didn't quite understand what had happened, Elvira packed her clothes in a sack and told her with the dull voice of one who has already made a decision and doesn't want anyone to argue it. That's what I raised you for, to help me when I can't. No one on the ranch said anything. A neighbor who saw it from the door of her house and lowered her eyes. The house of Don Amador Castellanos was in a distant municipality, with a corridor of clay pots and a wife who knew what was happening but had decided not to see it, because not seeing it was more comfortable than confronting it. Celestina worked from before dawn until after everyone slept. They didn't beat her. They didn't shout at her. She simply didn't exist, except when they needed something from her. And that, sometimes, hurts more than blows because it leaves no visible mark and no one can point to it. 8 years passed. Celestina became pregnant. When the pregnancy could no longer be hidden, Don Amador's wife knew what she had always suspected, and the whole house broke into an icy silence. A week later, Don Amador came to the room where Celestina slept, looked at her without dwelling much on her face, and said, "Tomorrow you leave. There's no place for you here anymore." He put 200 pesos on the bed and went out. Celestina gathered her things that night. She took the sack, the clothes, and the mended blanket that had been her grandmother's and that she kept folded at the bottom of the trunk since she arrived. That was everything she had. She left before dawn without anyone seeing her off, with her belly heavy and the 200 pesos in the pocket of her apron. Isidro was born 3 months later in the house of an unknown midwife who took her in without asking too much. He was a healthy boy, with dark eyes and a calm silence, and Celestina wrapped him in her grandmother's mended blanket from the very first moment, as if that old fabric could protect him from everything she had not been able to protect herself from. The highlands of Chiapas receive the traveler with a fog that doesn't always warn, a low mist that covers the dirt roads before dawn and turns them a single gray color that smells of pine and damp and distance. Celestina arrived at the fields of Don Clemente Nava on a Tuesday in October, when Isidro was 8 months old and the mended blanket already carried the marks of dozens of washings. She had walked from the crossing of the highway after the last passenger who gave her a lift turned north, and at the edge of the dirt track someone had written on a stone with lime, in clumsy but firm lettering, "Nava Flowers, 200 meters." The fields opened all at once. rows of white calla lilies under the fog, so orderly and so still that Celestina stopped without meaning to, because after so many years of ugly things, she had forgotten that the world could have that appearance. The flowers were neither many nor rare, but they were there, white and open in the cold of the morning, and in that moment they seemed to her the most honest thing she had seen in a long time. Don Clemente saw her from the edge of the field. He was a small man of slow gait, with a palm hat and the earth-colored hands that men have, who have spent decades working with it. He watched her come along the road with the sack on her shoulder and the baby in her arms, wrapped in the mended blanket, and he didn't ask her where she came from or why she arrived like that. "Come," was all he said, and he set off walking toward the house. Doa Pita came out to the door before they arrived. She was a slight woman, with gray hair gathered in a bun and an apron always on, with small eyes that saw everything without needing anyone to explain it to her. She looked at Isidro first. She held out her arms without saying anything. Celestina hesitated a second. It was the first time in a long while that someone held out their arms toward her, without wanting something in exchange. She let Doa Pita take the child. What Celestina didn't know was that this door was never going to close behind her again. The routine of the Nava fields had the goodness of things that repeat without lying. At dawn, when the fog comes down from the pines and stretches between the rows of flowers like a colorless sheet, Celestina was already in the field with the bucket in one hand and the cutting shears in the other. She learned that calla lilies are cut when the spadix is still green, before it opens completely, because that way they last longer in the vase at the market, and the lady who buys them can enjoy them more days. Don Clemente told her these things without impatience, in the tone of one who has explained the same thing many times, but always finds a new reason to say it well. Isidro slept at the edge of the field on the mended blanket spread over the straw sack. Sometimes he woke and lay looking at the sky of Chiapas, with that tranquil seriousness of babies who don't yet know that the world can disappoint. Celestina watched him out of the corner of her eye while she worked. Something inside her settled for the first time in a long while at the sight of that little sleeping face among the colors of the calla lilies. Doa Pita taught her the rosary on Thursday afternoons, the two of them seated on the stone corridor with Isidro between them and the rosary of wooden beads passing slowly between the old woman's fingers. "The first bead is for what one is grateful for," Doa Pita explained to her. "Even if it seems there's nothing, there's always something." Celestina gradually found what to put on each bead: the child's health, the cold of the mornings, the white calla lilies that opened each week, the kaftioya that Don Clemente prepared before anyone else was awake. A woman from the community, Doa Refugio, came by the field one Wednesday, bringing ranch eggs for Doa Pita, and stayed a moment watching Celestina cut flowers with Isidro tied to her back with the mended blanket. "How well he's tied on," said Doa Refugio. Doa Pita replied that it was a load that didn't weigh. Doa Refugio left without saying more, but as she passed where Celestina was, she put a brief hand on her shoulder, the way it's done in the mountain villages with the people one recognizes without having spoken much with them. Rodrigo, Don Clemente's eldest son, lived in the municipality and came down to the field on Saturdays. He was a quiet man with clean hands, who had studied administration and ended up working as an assistant in the municipal secretary's office, because in the highlands of Chiapas, that was the closest thing there was to what he knew how to do. The first time he saw Celestina, he asked her name. The second time he went, he brought her a notebook and a pencil so that Isidro would have something to draw with when he was older. One November afternoon, Rodrigo came down before Saturday. He had a different expression, more closed, and he looked for his father first, and then for Celestina in the field. "Did you work with a man named Amador Castellanos?" Celestina stopped cutting. Yes. He presented a document at the municipal secretary's office claiming you. He says you have an outstanding labor debt with him, and that you left taking goods that were his property. The silence fell over the rows of calla lilies, the way the fog falls, all at once and without warning. Rodrigo took a photocopy of the document out of his bag. Celestina took it. She recognized her mother's signature on the paper, the same small, cramped lettering as always, but beside it there was another signature she had never seen, and the date was recent, 2 weeks ago. But Rodrigo didn't yet know that this paper held something that was going to change everything. The night Rodrigo told Celestina what he had heard at the municipality, she stayed a long while seated on the corridor after everyone slept. The fog of the highlands of Chiapas covered the field of calla lilies, and the only sound was the wind among the pines of the hill. Celestina had the mended blanket over her legs and Doa Pita's rosary between her fingers. Not praying it, only holding it. She stayed like that until the cold became too much, and she went in to sleep. Rodrigo spent the next 3 days reviewing the files of the municipal secretary's office with the orderly patience of one who knows that papers don't lie if they're read well. The first thing he found was the original contract that Elvira had signed when Celestina was 16. A labor session contract for 5 years that had expired 3 years ago, with no registered renewal and with no signature from Celestina herself anywhere on the document. It was worth nothing from the legal point of view. It had never been worth anything since Celestina reached the age of majority without having ratified it. The second thing he found was worse. The new document Don Amador had presented alleged that Celestina owed him 18 months of advance salary and claimed among the removed goods a wool blanket with a declared value. The blanket her grandmother had left her. The blanket Isidro slept in. The first folio Rodrigo opened in the archive was the original labor session contract that Elvira had signed when Celestina was 16. It had the magistrate's seal and 2 witnesses' signatures, but in the space that said employee's signature there was nothing. Only a blank line. No one had signed in that space because Celestina had never been asked to. The law was clear. A service contract without the signature of the one providing the service was not a contract. It was a piece of paper. The second folio was more revealing. The original contract said 5 years of service. It expired the year Celestina was 21. But Celestina had remained in Don Amador's house 3 more years, with no registered renewal, no new contract, nothing. 3 years in which Don Amador had retained her without any legal instrument to back it up. The third finding was the one that made Rodrigo sit a moment without writing anything, looking at the folio. The new document Don Amador had presented claiming Celestina for labor debt had been signed by a notary whose seal belonged to a different municipality, 200 kilometers away, and whose registration number didn't correspond to any name in the current directory. The seal was false. Rodrigo came to the farm with Don Secundino, the municipal secretary, an older man of measured voice who read the 3 folios seated at Don Clemente's table with the same calm with which one reads the previous day's newspaper. As if the gravity of what he read didn't take away his composure, but did show in the fact that he didn't hurry the coffee they set in front of him. The original contract was never valid, he said when he finished. The cession made over a minor without her consent has full nullity by law. The later contract doesn't exist. And the new document has an apocryphal seal, which makes it a false instrument. He paused. If Mr. Castellanos tries to enforce this in any venue, the one with a legal problem is him, not you. The secretary signed the certificate of annulment of the folio right there, on the kitchen table of Don Clemente and Doa Pita, with the rosary of wooden beads hanging on the back wall, and Isidro asleep in the mended blanket on the mat in the corner. Celestina read the certificate twice. For a moment, she had no words left. "Does this mean he can't claim anything from me anymore?" she asked. "Nothing," said the secretary. "He never had legal right over you. And if he presents papers of this nature again, the secretary's office reports him to the public prosecutor." Doa Pita crossed herself in silence. Don Amador's administrator presented himself at the Nava flower fields on the Friday of that same week. A dry man of few words who arrived in a truck along the dirt track and found Don Clemente waiting for him at the entrance to the field. Behind Don Clemente was Rodrigo with the municipal papers in his hand. At the far end of the corridor, standing next to the table with Isidro on her arm, was Celestina. He was a dry man, in a suit that wasn't from the region, and shoes that were clearly from the city, and he looked at the fields of calla lilies with the expression of one who doesn't understand why anyone would want to live where there is so much cold and so many flowers. Don Clemente waited for him, standing at the entrance to the field with his arms crossed over his chest, with that way of standing that men have who have spent decades planted in a piece of land and no longer move easily from where they are. "I bring documentation for Mrs. Celestina Pacheco," said the administrator. "Everyone's here," answered Don Clemente. "Say what you have to say." The administrator took out the document. Rodrigo took it before it reached anyone else's hands, opened it, read it diagonally, and then took the certificate of annulment of the folio with Don Secundino's seal out of his bag and held it out to the administrator. "This is what applies," said Rodrigo. "The document you bring was annulled at the municipality 4 days ago. The folio has a registration number. If you need to verify it, the secretary's office is open Monday to Friday." The administrator read the certificate. He read it twice. He looked at Rodrigo. He looked at Don Clemente. "Don Amador is not going to accept this." "Don Amador has no legal option," said Rodrigo. "And if he tries to present that instrument in any venue, there's a problem of an apocryphal seal that's going to have to be explained. That's also registered." The administrator put the document away in his briefcase with movements that tried to seem calm and didn't quite manage it. Doa Pita, who had come out to the corridor with the rosary between her hands, watched him move off down the dirt road without saying anything. Only when the sound of the truck was lost among the pines did she squeeze the beads of the rosary and close her eyes a moment. There was a silence. "Don Amador is going to present himself again," said the administrator. Don Clemente answered without moving from the spot, with his hands in the pockets of his trousers and the calm of a man who has spent decades cultivating things that take time to grow. "There's always someone here, sir. Don't worry." The administrator left. Celestina waited for the sound of the truck to disappear among the pines of the road. Then she looked at Don Clemente, at Doa Pita, at Rodrigo. "I didn't steal anything that was his," she said in a still voice. "The only thing I took was my son and my grandmother's blanket." Don Clemente nodded. "We know," he said. "An invented debt obliges no one. What does oblige is conscience, and that he had already lost long before Celestina left." Doa Pita put the rosary of wooden beads into her hands. She said nothing. It wasn't necessary. That spring, when the rows of calla lilies bloomed more heavily laden than the year before, and the fog of the highlands of Chiapas began to lift before midday, the Nava flower field had a different presence. Rodrigo had helped Don Clemente formally register Celestina as a field worker with all the papers in order, and the name Celestina Pacheco was set down in a municipal folio with a permanence that had nothing extraordinary about it for anyone who looked at it from the outside. But that for her meant something she had not had in all her adult life: to exist on paper as a person, not as a debt. Isidro had learned to walk among the rows of flowers. He took short, sure steps over the damp earth. with his arms open to balance himself. And sometimes he stopped in front of a white calla lily and looked at it with that seriousness small children have when something seems too beautiful to pass by. The mended blanket was no longer useful for carrying him, because it was too big for that. But it remained in the room, folded over the wooden chair, with its patches of different colors that were like a map of all the years it had survived. Don Clemente and Doa Pita aged slowly, in the tranquil way that people age who did what they had to do and carry no guilt for what they didn't do. Doa Pita prayed the rosary every night on the corridor, and sometimes Celestina sat beside her without speaking, only keeping her company, because she had learned that silent company is a form of gratitude that words don't always manage to express. On Sundays, when they went down to the municipal market, Doa Refugio, who had seen Celestina arrive months earlier with the sack and the baby and that expression of someone who doesn't know whether she'll be allowed to stay, now greeted her in a different way. Not with pity, not with curiosity, with that quiet respect that in small villages is worth more than any certificate, because it isn't granted with a signature but with time, and with what people have seen with their own eyes. Because the door that opens out of compassion can never be closed by anyone's malice. Don Clemente and Doa Pita didn't know who Celestina was when they saw her come along the road with the baby in her arms. They didn't need to know. It was enough to see a woman alone with a child and a place to go, and to open the door. Sometimes that is all it takes for an entire life to change direction. Who appeared in your life when no one looked at you anymore? If this story reached your heart, leave your comment down below and tell us from which part of the world you're joining us. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the little bell. Share it with someone who needs to remember that there are people in this world who open doors without asking anything in exchange. Until the next story. At the Sunday market in the municipality, when Celestina passed with Isidro by the hand and the calla lilies of the Nava field wrapped in brown paper under her arm, people greeted her differently, with that quiet respect that isn't asked for and isn't explained, but that whoever has earned it recognizes beyond any doubt.